Hey witches, it's Lee and this is Do the Magical Thing, and let's have a little chat about maturation and witchcraft, or maturing into your practice. And I thought this was appropriate as I'm coming up to 6 years being a witch in November, and also, you know, just I always think, as I said at the beginning of starting this channel, it's important to look back and go, oh, do I agree with myself, do I not? And that applies to practice as well. So basically what we're going to do is look at 13 reflections that I have that are from myself, but hopefully apply to everybody, or maybe they won't. I mean, that's, you know, it's fine. But I'm also going to give you, as the magical thing to do today, 13 prompts to ask yourself to really think about what are your experiences, why are you doing what you're doing. Is there something that needs to change, etc, etc. So we'll go into it, we'll get into it, let's relax and get into it. So firstly, I've got my little notebook down here. I've realised this is really helpful for me with the whole ADHD thing, because sometimes I try and do without, and I'm like, no, I've got it in my head, but I haven't got it in my head because I don't even know when I walk into another room what I'm doing, so let alone trying to remember 13 points. So I'm employing a notebook here, and I've noticed Kellyanne Malick's doing this, and I really respect that. I'm like, cool, if a witch who's written a book can do this shit, I can do this shit too. So yeah, so numero uno, number one, is you get more specific but less rigid. And really what I mean by this is and oftentimes when you first start out, you put yourself into a little witchy box, or you're seeking little witchy boxes. It feels safe in this world of witches everywhere, and they all seem very confident, and you're like, God, if people ask me what I am, I need to justify myself. Okay, right, I'm this kind of witch. And then you go, well, as I'm this kind of witch, I'm only going to learn this sort of thing. And, you know, when I first started out, I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm only going to learn about witchcraft. I don't need all this ceremonial nonsense, blah, blah, blah. And as I've got older, I'm like, most of that ceremonial nonsense has informed the witchcraft practice of today. So, yeah, so really it's about kind of going, So now I'm seeking more specific. So I might be looking at specific grimoires, specific figures in history, specific plants. I might be looking at a specific area, and I get these little paths of info that I go hunting on, or not hunting but exploring, you know, and I start to really go on these little rabbit holes, which is great. But at the same time, I'm less rigid in how I perhaps apply those to my own practice and how I define my practice as such. Definitions are helpful, labels are helpful, of course, we're a labelling kind of people, but I think it is one of those things where if you can kind of give yourself almost like a kind of mirage-y border that you can cross, do you know what I mean? Like your little protective shield you might do. It's kind of there, but it's also crossable if you so decide, right? And this is not an excuse, you know, to misappropriate things, but it's just a license to consider what's going on out there that perhaps is open to you, and that you might want to engage with. That is outside of the box you put yourself in. As always, respect folks from oppressed minorities. And with the practices that are considered closed, obviously there's a lot of debate on that, but realistically it's just about respect. And if you're invited in, you're invited in. If you're not, then maybe you know, either speak to an informed source from that practice, or perhaps go, you know what, there's plenty of other practice out there for me that I can access. Number two is two in the UK like that, it's slightly different to what it means in the US, I think, or some places. But anyway, number two, to be friendly, is that you don't have to prove yourself. Instead, you value your own experience. So as I just said with the whole thing about having to sort of go, you know, when people ask you what kind of witch you are, and you feel like, oh, okay, I've got to come up with, I'm a green fairy tree witch, and you're like, okay, well, I'm an earth centered fire cloud witch, and you're just, none of these things really matter other than to yourself, right? So with things like that, you learn actually, I don't have to say I'm Billy Big Cauldrons. Do you know what I mean? I'm Billy Big Cauldrons out there in this little witchy pond, where really it's about gaining knowledge, and for me, sharing knowledge and expressing that, building a practice, getting, you know, reaping the rewards of that practice, whether it's just the discipline of doing it, or whether it's the fact of just having a bit of fun and seeing magical effects in the world, or the benefit, if you're purely on a psychological model, the benefit it has to your psyche, you know. less about going, I am this, I'm that, and the other, and more about, look, I've had some great experiences within this, I've had some thoughtful experiences or thought-provoking experiences, and I'm okay with that, and I'm okay with not having to put it all out there. I'm okay with not having to sort of be so projective. You kind of get, I've noticed myself being less projective and more receptive and thoughtful, and you know, that's not to say I'm not projective sometimes, and there's a difference between oversharing and perhaps discussion. Do you know what I mean? We'll come on to that a bit later. Number 3 is that witch wars are less appealing and collaboration increases. So witch wars, they're kind of a term, if you haven't heard them, of like internet, you know, flame wars, where a couple of witchy groups go off at each other, folks within witchy groups go off at each other, you know, all this stuff. And, you know, it's a whole pissing contest, and it's just, yeah, it's a whole mess. And, you know, I've had this in reality, I've had it in like physical life as well as virtual life, of people getting their, you know, noses put out of joint, dents in their cauldrons over things that really don't matter, that are things that are really simple. And actually, when you reflect, you're like, well, who does this serve? Who does this benefit? And the further you get into your practice, you're like, look, I don't actually need to care about this or that or the other. You know, that's actually not, does it affect my practice? No. Does this, you know, what is this really? Is this actually benefiting me? And it's that you kind of go from this calling out to calling in a way. And so I've definitely noticed myself where before I'd be like, oh, that person's this and this for not knowing this, or for not believing, or for believing this, or whatever it might be, or, you know, they've said something that's really I don't agree with, and so I'm going to really come down on them. Now I probably ask for more clarification. It's not to say sometimes people don't fucking boil my cauldron and I get, you know, wound up. It's not to say that at all. There's plenty of things to be wound up at. Do you know what I mean? I took a few of the old boxes of the local, you know, kick me fucking figures of today's society. And so there are things that I will become defensive over. But now I've sort of learned to be a bit more strategic in that defence. And also just know that, like, really where it's at is collaboration, because you're going to have some amazing allies from those conversations where you go, did you mean this? Or could you just clarify this for me? And if they clarify their point and they turn out to be just an utter arsehole, that's fine. You know, that person isn't for me. That group isn't for me. Goodbye. If it's something that you need to perhaps shout about because it's affecting an oppressed minority, because it's affecting, you know, yourself or your family or, you know, your community, fair enough. But let's consider that these all people are humans, and humans are fucking fallible, right? Humans are fallible, and they're going to have mistakes, and they're going to regret those mistakes. But just consider, is it worth the losses? And the losses are your mental health. The losses are your pride. The losses are potentially your community if you really start ostracising yourself in different ways, or behaving in ways that are inflammatory all the time, which just is not, you know, if you've got inflammation, what are you going to have? Fucking just heartburn. I don't know. You're going to not feel great, right? But yeah, so that's my point, is that less of that, more collaboration. You know, since working with the Critical Thinking Witch Collective, it's been so brilliant to see other witches really seeking out to promote, not in all this sort of like TikTok-y way of like, oh, not TikTok. I don't want to piss on TikTok because that feels very ageist and all this stuff. Not in the social media way of, oh, promote your thing here, promote your thing. Do you know when you ever post something on social media and someone's like, promote it here? And you're like, I don't want to promote things. Perhaps I just want to share it for the sake of sharing it, you know? But yeah, I think this is the thing with Critical Thinking Witch Collective, and you can find more information about that on criticalthinkingwitches.com. It is this collaboration of people who want to highlight witches, who are not necessarily the big name pagans and all this stuff. They are folks who are just witches doing their thing from all sorts of part of the, you know, of the witchcraft community, who are thinking critically about their practice and its impact on themselves and on the environment, you know. So yeah, since I've been engaged in more collaboration, that's been great. And especially as a solitary sort of practitioner, I sometimes struggle in group dynamics. I've tried the group thing. Sometimes I feel like yay, sometimes I feel like nay, do you know what I mean? And I think trust is the key. And actually, what I really feel this strength is study groups rather than perhaps practice groups in a way. Because you can study together, and from that might come something interesting. Number 4 is You learn what to share and what you don't need to. And this kind of goes to number 2 about not having to prove yourself. There are certain things that I would share before that I probably wouldn't share now, whether they are spells, like the active spells, you know, where the result hasn't come by yet, or they're spells for other people. And I'm not really now, I'm not sure whether I would share a spell that I was doing for somebody else. I'm not sure whether I'd share the ingredients even. Not necessarily the ingredients list, that's fine, but a picture of the ingredients, because for me those ingredients are a spirit in themselves that contribute to that spell. And so I actually feel like, especially casting and sigils that I make for other people, unless I've got permission to share as part of like a portfolio or something, I wouldn't necessarily share those. Whereas before, I would put anything really on the internet. Again, part of trying to prove myself as knowing what I was on about, which, and the more you know, the more you realise you don't know. But yeah, so realistically, there are things that I don't share. There are certain ritual tools that I wouldn't necessarily share, because again, it's that sense of it having something unique about it, and I don't want that uniqueness necessarily accessible to everybody. And yeah, I think that's okay. I've really struggled because I always bang on the channel about accessibility and all this stuff, but I've realised there's a difference between accessibility and privacy, right? I think that's actually an important point. So I think for me, you start to learn what to share and what not to share. This is not to say that if you're sharing spells, you're a bad witch, or if you're sharing, your altar space or your offering stead or whatever it might be, you're a bad witch. I mean, look, it's behind me, guys. Like, you can't miss it. But yeah, I'm not necessarily showing an active working as such. And that's just a personal choice. I think it's important to have examples, and when you can use a spell that is almost like a inert spell that is an example spell for people to follow. I think that's fine. But I do find that when I try and record stuff like that, unless I'm doing the spell, and the spell kind of knows, as a being in itself, knows that its purpose is to educate, its purpose is to inform, then I feel like the spell can almost get a little shy. Do you know what I mean? And that, for the psychological model peeps, is probably me projecting. But for me, as an animist witch, to label myself, for me, I feel like it is important that the spirit of the spell is in collaboration with you. So yeah, and it's okay to share stuff. I'm never going to dismiss people for sharing things. There's things that I wouldn't necessarily share from my perspective, but there's things that I would share, too. And I think it's important to have access, because otherwise, I wouldn't have gained the knowledge I have without people sharing their knowledge and such like. But yeah, I think it's important to also consider, where is that knowledge shared? Is it somewhere in a group that you are close to, that you are, trust? Is it knowledge that you're sharing to a wider group who you kind of know most but not all? How does that affect sort of how and what you're sharing? And is it public? Is it to everybody? Considerations on how that affects things. People in your family who might see that, thinking about your safety and such like, depending on what community you're in, and how witchcraft and magic is received in those communities, all that kind of stuff, right? So yeah, so it's just being like, actually this is for me, this practice is for me, it's not for everybody else, or my practice, my individual practice is not for everyone else to see. Witchcraft as a whole is, for everybody, go for it, but your practice doesn't have to be shared, Number 5 is that you gain practical experience, not just theoretical knowledge. And so a lot of our time can be spent with our noses in books, and rightly so, because we're seeking to learn, we're seeking to do things right. But I'm going to tell you now, there might be a way to do a particular ritual, but really there isn't a right way to witch as such. Do you know what I mean? Or at least there's no one right way to witch. There are many paradigms out there, and so you really do have to sort of get off the armchair or just get your hands dirty in some way. Maybe you can't get off the armchair, that's fair enough, but you get your hands dirty, whether it's with a ritual that is purely in your mind, whether it's a ritual that is a physical ritual, but just do something that is a actual spell, an actual ritual, not just thinking about it, not just gathering stuff for it, not just making pretty pictures in your notebook about it, not just using a moon tracker about it. Actually do the thing, do the magical thing, right? And that's the whole thing. Because when you gain that practical experience, there's nothing like having and I get a lot of joy from learning, right? I get a lot of joy from learning things and discovering stuff and all that kind of things, all those kind of things. But there's nothing like having a result from a spell occur, and whether you think it's psychological or not, it doesn't matter, because it's a result, right? When you have that result, you go, oh shit, this might be a thing. This might actually be fucking real. Like, okay, it's not fireballs from me fucking hands, but it's something that is a tangible result. Wow, okay, that's pretty cool. And the more you have those results, the more you feel confident in going forward. And this leads, again, back to number 2, in that you don't have to keep proving yourself, because you've got those valid experiences that you have interpreted. You've not gone online and gone, what does it mean, right? You've thought about it yourself through your own lens, because that's really the only way you can look at these experiences. And then, you've gone, okay, this is what it means to me, fair enough. Sometimes you'll get an interesting perspective from other people, but oftentimes it is your own paradigm, because you should have set up the spell, and I use the word should there, but, if you're looking for a particular result, give it the prompt, give the spell the prompt to create that result. I will see this, I will hear that, I will come across this is the amount, this is the, whatever it is, just be clear on the result. And you can watch previous videos on the story of a spell, which will explain the steps of spell work for you on the channel. Number 6 is you start or are settled into which habits have basic ritual and formula and don't have to go by the book anymore. And that speaks to the previous one, really, in that, well, when you've done these bits and bobs of your practical experience, you've done a few rituals, you've done a few this, that and the other, you start to gain a routine. You start to realise what works for you, what doesn't work for you. Is that you feel like cleansing every time is not necessary because you're in a ritual space? Is it that you feel like, actually, I like to do it this particular way of circle management, if you indeed use a circle? Do you perhaps use a particular hand movement? Is there a colour that you always tend to use? Is there a piece of material or some kind of ritual, materia magica, that you always use, regardless of the correspondences for that thing? Regardless of what people may say or the books say or whatever it is, you go, this is what works for me, this is what puts me in a ritual space or puts me in a magical mindset, this is how I do magic, and that's fine, right? And you start each day with, you have your little routines, your little witchy routines. So I have a cleansing ritual, I have a protective ritual, I have several protective rituals, but at different points of the day I might do different things. When I'm on different days I do different things, on different moon phases, on different seasonal days I have different things, and these are things that I don't necessarily have to think about too much because they've become habit. And really, witchcraft is a habit, because if you're doing it sort of here and there, you're not necessarily going to get as much out of it. And that's not to say I've had fallow days, do you know what I mean? I surely have, but the more consistent you are with it, and every time I'm more consistent with witchcraft, the more benefit I find, the more things occur that I'm like, that's interesting, and I think when you're saying to the universe, or whatever power it is you feel is appropriate, hey, I'm looking out and I'm listening and I'm here and I'm aware, I'm present, I do feel like you get more in return. You do get more little prods and things that are quite fun. So yeah. Number 7 is when not to do a spell and when to do a spell. So when you first start out, and this kind of feels funny, doesn't it, coming from the previous point, but when perhaps you don't need to whip out the old herbs and candles and all that shenanigans, whether indeed something is worth that effort, because spells should take effort. You are essentially magically working out, right? And I think, David Rankin speaks to this about it, being something that takes an effort and he has an interesting paradigm for that I'm going to look at potentially in a future video. But yeah, really it's about that kind of concept of really making the effort, and effort being that key thing. And maybe you're low on spoons that day. Maybe you need to kind of just pare it back, right? And with my daily rituals, right, I have a basic form of them and I have a more complex form of them. So depending on the amount of time I've got, depends on what form I have, right? Because I want to be doing the magic, and so I make it easier for me to do the magic. And if I can do more of the magic, great. If I can't, I can't. It is what it is, right? You know, it's like a phone call to a relative that you like. Sometimes it's better to get a quick phone call in, not necessarily the hour long or whatever it is, you know, conversation you're going to have, because you still had that contact time. And for me, that's the same with magic, right? So yeah, but it's also that, you know, people aren't, you know, when not to do a spell, as in like, actually, is there a mundane way I can deal with this? You know, maybe if it's about money management, maybe are there some direct debits you could potentially cancel? Is there a better thing you can move to, which is going to be more helpful to you? And it takes effort, but that effort is also, you know, important, right? Yeah, you can do a spell to attract more money, but if you aren't getting rid of the things that are draining you, that's not always going to help, you know what I mean? So yeah, things like that. Now, you also learn sort of, actually most folks aren't worth baneful work, you know, and actually for me, I feel like baneful work is most potent when you save, and you have, the thing is, here's a difference. There's a difference between knowing how to and not wanting to, and not being able to hex, right? Because a person who doesn't want to does know how to, but the person who's not able to cannot regardless, right? And I think that really with any sort of hex work, curse work and that kind of stuff, perhaps there are things to do before that, you know, explore, is there a mundane option? So say someone's pissing you off, you know, have you actually communicated with them and gone, hey, you know what, that really fucking hurt me, or you know what, that was a dick move. And if it's not safe to, it's not safe to. Fair enough, do you know what I mean? But has that process been gone through first? If not, then okay, is there someone else who can have that conversation with you? Is it like perhaps a conversation we had with several people? You know, is it that they're perhaps being harmful? Is there a way to stop that harm? You know, maybe you've done a binding spell, maybe you've done a freezer spell, all this stuff, right? Could you ask for a protection spell from your ancestors, from your land spirits that you're engaged with? You know, are there certain ways you can do that? Then really, if you're getting to that point where you look, I've tried it, I've been there and done it, and you know what, I'm asking for this because I fucking need it, or I'm casting this because I need it, then you go ahead, mate, you go ahead. No one's going to judge you if you go straight to that. And I think with more experiences of which, you learn when the appropriateness is needed, right? It's the difference between, you know, someone who is kind of being playful with you, and, you know, messing about, you know, and you can go, no, stop it. Whereas there's someone who was being a dick and you're like, no, stop it. Do you know what I mean? So that's the kind of levels you want to think about. Obviously, I go louder, but I don't want to, you know, be loud, or louder than I already am. So, yeah, you learn when is appropriate, when is not appropriate. I'm never going to judge anyone for, you know, whether they hex or not. Absolutely not. You know, I'm a big proponent of the Hex Positive podcast, which really spends a lot of time not talking about hexes. It's not really, you know, Brina Gowan has a fantastic podcast, Hex Positive, which really does give you some great learning and just some fun as well. So definitely check it out. You know, I always bang on about Brie. But yeah, so realistically, I am Hex Positive. I think you go for it. But sometimes you learn, maybe this needs to scale back before it gets to that full extent. I always have ingredients on me, and I have a particular curse that I know that has been effective when it was necessary to use. But it's something that, you know, does cast heavy on my heart, and I think, okay, well, is it worth my sort of softiness, my desire to be kind and all that? Is it worth impeding on that to do it? Obviously, if pushed, I absolutely will use baneful magic, but it's not something that I desire to do off the first bat. Again, I try and seek from a collaborative perspective first. So yeah, and just, yeah, consider the mundane first and then go for the magical. Now, number 8 is you can listen to other witches and appreciate their point without taking it on board in your practice. That might sound a bit weird, but basically what that means is that when I was first starting out in witchcraft, I definitely was like trying to, all the information I gained from different witches, different practices, all this stuff, I was like, right, I need to do this, I need to add this, I need to add that. Okay, well, what about this, what about that? And it kind of makes you into this very scattered practice that, does it serve you, or is it the best of, the stuff you're hearing? Is it actually just this very kind of scattergun approach to practice, and not really any kind of, is there any sense of congruency through that, So just, you can listen to witches and go, that's really interesting. How would I apply that in my practice? Well, actually I already have an existing thing that I do in my practice which covers this. So I don't necessarily need to do this, or I don't feel like I need to add this, but perhaps I could consider this aspect of it, And again, over time, it gets easier to sort of filter this out. Sometimes we can easily get intimidated by people who have written fantastic tomes, who do amazing podcasts, who do brilliant, channels and whatever that. But it's worth going, does this really apply to me? This works for them, but does it apply to me? Not so sure. Number 9 is that you can see I forgot to write this. You can see a bullshitter and leave well alone, or correct calmly when appropriate. This is partly going back to the whole witch wars thing, but basically there's a lot of misinformation in witchcraft and in the occult community, and you start to smell a bullshitter pretty quick after a while. You start to smell the ridiculous claims, the seeking for money, the appealing to, some kind of ancestral message, all that sort of stuff. And before you might have like piled on this person, now you might well just avoid them, block them, whatever it might be. Or if it's a position where they're using their outright kind of lies and abuse or scams and that kind of thing, you might well put a little warning out there for other people. But yeah, oftentimes I've found that if someone's like that, they are starving for attention, and the less you give them attention, the better, really. So that's just my take on that. I do think it's important to hold people to account in a kindly, direct way, and especially establish their intent first. Again, going back to a previous point. Number 10, you don't lie about your skills, experiences, but you're more confident with your range. And this, kind of prevents you being a bullshitter, really, I suppose. But I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with a witch and they've gone, I saw a fairy in the corner of my garden, or I saw this, or I saw that, or blah, blah, blah. And you're like, fuck, I haven't seen anything like that. I haven't seen this, I haven't seen that. Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, oh, yeah, for sure. Right? And you ain't, mate, you ain't. Or you have, but you've seen something slightly different, or you haven't seen it like that, or you've experienced it more as a voice, or you've experienced it more as a thought, and you're not even sure if it was not just your thought, and all this kind of stuff, right? And again, you can filter this through regular practice, but it's very easy to be like, yeah, right? And part of you is thinking, I want to look around and go, am I the only one thinking, what the fuck is this, right? And this is not to deny people their experiences, absolutely tickety-boo, but what it is to say is that, this is something Eliphas Levi writes in Transcendental Magic. He writes of, this is my experience, and I write this not to convince, but just to express what happened. And I feel like that is what I tend to sort of try and be like with my experiences and results from things. I'm like, look, this is just my experience. It might well, manifest in a different way to other people, and that's absolutely fine. But you get more confident in your range. You might go like, oh, well, I'm not really sort of strong on that bit, or I've not really done much work in that area, but what I am doing is this, And so you can go, okay, well, that's not my experience. That sounds fascinating, but for me, this is where I'm at. So you can still share without being like, yeah. Do you know what I mean? Which is just not helpful, because there's other people there thinking the same as you, and you're just not giving space for them either, which is a shame. Number 11. You have a ridiculous book collection, but are more selective these days. So, so I've recently got more books. I mean, my wife, bless her, Mrs. Toad, she is so patient with me, and my endless book, every wish list I have, birthdays or Christmas, or Yuletide, it's always books, and maybe the odd weird thing that I'm suddenly got into. But, so here's the thing though, when you first start in witchcraft, and I don't know about you, but I wasted a lot of money on shitty books, right? And now I've got I've got a fair amount of books, but I've donated some, I've given some to people who I think they would be more appropriate for, if I've, looked at them and thought these are interesting, but I've kind of gained what I can from them. And I've now started to be more focused on getting better quality books, so books that are written by occult academics, or written by people who are very thoughtful about things. Witchcraft authors don't have to be academic by any stretch, but the ones that employ the kind of academic reasoning or critical thinking I often find very helpful, because generally they include a bibliography, which is a fucking bonus, or it shouldn't be a bonus, it should be standard really. They tend to source better, and they also spread less misinformation. And I just think it's worth spending a little bit more if you can to get something of better quality than some generic thing, right? So for instance, recently I got the Grimoire Encyclopedia by David Rankin, and I got that because I really wanted scholarly and thorough exploration of the grimoires and contrasting them and all this kind of stuff, rather than just getting a bunch of grimoires without any context or anything like that. You can get them cheap on a USB stick, or you can get them cheap as like an ebook download. I'm not going to have any particular context. They're probably going to be very poor translations, probably very poorly formatted and all that kind of stuff. Whereas spending a bit more, I got something that is incredibly in-depth, incredibly helpful, and well put together, and something that will hopefully last. So yeah, I do recommend checking out Foolish Fish for book reviews. I'm going to be doing some more book reviews myself because they seem to be pretty popular, but Foolish Fish is definitely worth watching, because just in general, because it's an interesting chat, but also because of the sort of books that he has out there. I've definitely bought things because of seeing them on the channel, and I wouldn't have heard about them otherwise, which is really great. And that's why it's important for me, because I have a different focus than Dennis, but I think it's important to put more works out there. And you have been asking for more book stuff, so I will be putting them more out there soon. Also, here's number 12. You know the difference between witch history and the history of witchcraft. You think, well, what's the difference with that? It's the same thing, right? Not so much. So things like the Wiccan kind of effects on witchcraft as a whole was there are certain Wiccan histories and Wiccan kind of myths, as Ronald Hutton would probably put them. I think he had put them. I'm not sure those exact words, so credit where credit's due, but it's probably a paraphrase there. But essentially these kind of myths within different practices. Now, things like the burning times being a thing, things like 9 million witches, we know that these things are mythological, they're not factual. The history of witchcraft really puts the figures of the period of time of like witch crazes and such like, there was no necessarily burning times as such, but they put the figures at around 40 to 90,000 really, and the 90,000 is the upper estimate, but really it's that kind of 40 to 90 range, and that's a whole lot different, isn't it, than 9 million. And we have this goes back to the previous point about books, because this misinformation and these mythos, they get spread outside of their own traditions, and they get into wider practice, and they become this whole thing, which is just it's a real pickle, because then people go, well, this happened and that happened, and they get this kind of, and especially what frustrates me is that there are people within the witchcraft community who have no experience of oppression and somehow think that this mythological time of the burning times gives them a right to feel utterly oppressed and to bang on about it, when these are people who otherwise do not experience oppression, and certainly not to the levels of certain members of the community that they probably either don't care about, actively work against, or are at least unhelpful to. So yeah, let's not use false history to try and make ourselves feel like victims. No, let's work together as a community to raise everybody up. But also, just false history, it can make you look very foolish, and I think it's just well worth reading an actual book on the history of witchcraft in terms of folk practices, in terms of the fact that a lot of people accused of witchcraft were actually just in the wrong place, wrong time, innocent people. I'm not saying that every person accused of witchcraft wasn't a witch, because I don't think that's necessarily accurate. I wouldn't say they wouldn't call themselves that, they wouldn't call themselves those terms perhaps, but there are certainly practitioners, cunning folk and the like, who were caught up in certain things. So that perhaps gives you, and again, by learning about the history of witchcraft rather than witch history, as in history of witchcraft practices, in terms of witchcraft traditions, then you start to go, hang on, that doesn't match up with this, and well, I found out this bit of information, maybe I'll learn more about cunning folk, for instance, or whatever it might be. So just think about the history as it's applied to you if you never knew a thing about witchcraft and you were just a student of, say, the 16th century, 17th century, or whatever, and then think of it as a witch practicing and thinking, okay, what's the history of the traditions here? What sources informed them? Are those sources still sources that stand up today? Margaret Murray, for instance, who gets an eye roll from most witches because her whole witch craze of Northern Europe thing just was a whole pickle in terms of the actual, and really was rejected at the time, but inspired a few folks out there, and has unfortunately pervaded its way through time. And the great thing about academia is that it keeps looking at itself and critiquing itself and going, is this still true? Does this still hold up? And more voices come out and go, maybe not. So that's just something to think about. Learn about the history of witchcraft, learn about your particular tradition's history, or what you're interested in is history, but let's not conflate myth and fact, because actually sometimes the facts are far more fascinating than the mythos we buy into. And speaking about buying into, number 13, you don't have to buy every witch thing, but pay more attention to your environment. So this is really like, I do, when it comes to Halloween, I do a little scour of the shops, right? Whereas before, I'd probably buy anything with a bloody pumpkin on it, or anything with a witch thing on it, or whatever it might be. Nowadays, I give myself a kind of limit, and I think, right, I need to really, really want this. It needs to serve a purpose, or it needs to be exceptionally beautiful, or something that, appeals not just to me, but to the household, or whatever it might be, right? So I'm far more selective in that. And it comes the same sort of thing with witch tools, and witch books, to be fair, as we sort of mentioned before. But there are certain things that I'm not going to buy just because it's got a cauldron on it, or just because it's got, a cat on it, or a broom on it, or whatever it might be. Because is it actually contributing to my practice? Is it perhaps taken away? Is it a barrier to actually just getting on with it? And I had an interesting conversation with the DIY witch about this concept and this consumerism concept, and I'm hoping to bring them on the channel soon, after a very special guest. So what I was saying, are you witch consuming or are you witch crafting? Do you know what I mean? And I think that's something that really is worth asking ourselves. We're going to discuss that in that conversation that's coming up in the future. Fingers crossed. So that's really where I'm at. Thinking about, do I need to buy this shiny thing? Or actually, is there a fantastic stone that's on my, road? Is it in the park and I found this little pebble that's actually amazing and has less ethical complications than some of the crystals that we come across in the witch community? Do you even need crystals for that matter? One of those things, isn't it? Historically, a bit of a contention. So that's my kind of thing. That's my that's the magical theory, so to speak, if you can call it that. Or at least that's my theories that I have kind of approached in my practice over the last coming up 6 years. Now, let's do the magical thing. So, 13 questions to ask yourself. Number 1 is, what do you think of the different occult paths? What should or can you explore? So really kind of thinking about, what have you explored so far? What is open to you now? just worth having a little think there, right? So what do you think of the different occult paths? Has your mind changed on these things as well, right? Number 2 is, what myths or lore have I researched and do they still hold up? So what is it that's really kind of tickled your, bubbled your cauldron, so to speak? But like we said, is there some misinformation in there? Is there stuff that's helpful? Is there not? Number 3 is there anything I need to remove from my practice? So perhaps there's something that you didn't know was an appropriated thing. Perhaps there's something that doesn't work for anymore, but you're still doing it because people have told you should, Think about what do you need to remove from your practice. And number 4 number 4 is there anything I need to add? So perhaps you're not feeling fulfilled in your practice and you think, this is not working for me. This is that. Just think, okay, is there something actually I could add to this? Is it a daily practice? Is it a weekly practice? Is it working with a particular thing? And just consider what it is that you want to add in there. And number 5 is, how have my definitions changed for the following terms? So consider, how would you define terms like witch, magic, witchcraft, practice, religion, ritual, spirit, nature, science, experiment, spell, coven? Have your definitions changed? If not, why not? If they have, what's changed? Number 6 is, what do I think about covens and group ritual? I always struggle with the word ritual. What about solitary practice? So what do I think about covens and group ritual? What about solitary practice? For me, I used to think I really wanted to be in a group, and now I'm not so much. And although I am in a couple of groups, ironically, these are groups that are more witches working on their own thing and then sharing those experiences. Number 7, what things do I need to unlearn from my practice? So this again is about removal, but perhaps removal of things that are perhaps problematic now, perhaps are things that have been debunked. Again, it speaks to earlier sort of questions, but it's important to really think about, okay, these are things I've learned, what do I need to unlearn? And it's okay. And the reason I emphasise this so much is because we can be so resistant to change. So perhaps I'm knocking on the head a bit with this one. Number 8 is, what focus do I have on my local environment? So oftentimes we can think about these, products and produce from elsewhere, from overseas, from wherever it might be, and that involves a lot of air miles, that involves a lot of pollution, that involves a lot of stuff that you're not really necessarily even connected to. So what about your local environment? What is there that's on your street? What weeds are growing that you could use in spell work? What, spirit, is there a street tree you can engage with? Is there a park you should perhaps visit a bit more? Is there an old site that, you haven't gone to yet that you really need to, which is just nearby? How can you interact with the city that you're in, with the village you're in, wherever you're in? How are you working within your community as a witch, So just consider those sort of things. What focus do I have on my local environment? And that also includes like waterways and such like, yeah? Number 9, where am I putting or spending my energy, and is that helping me? So this can really be a moment to just be like, hang on, and just kind of breathe a little bit and go, am I actually getting something out of the effort I'm doing? If you're doing a daily practice, that's fine. If it's fulfilling. If it's not, what's the point? Do you know what I mean? What is the point of it? And number 10. When was the last time I cast a spell? When was the last time? Right, I know it might be a little bit of a call out, right? And here's the thing, if you're poorly, if you're struggling with low spoons and all that shenanigans, fair enough. I get you, I've been there, trust me. But it's also worth asking yourself, what is actually stopping me from doing a spell? Maybe that is indeed a better question. But yeah, when was the last time you cast a spell? Alfair Sebastiani says it's called witchcraft, not witch think, yeah? Do the thing. Get on with it, because you're going to enjoy it. You're going to enjoy it. And the more you do it, the more you're going to get used to it and get those paradigms I talked about. And number 11. How is technology affecting or involved in your practice? Is it useful or contributing? So for me, I've realised that I need to limit my time on certain apps and actually use that time instead. For instance, I'm learning Latin on Duolingo, right? And I am aware that there's different types of Latin, I know that. But I am really using time that I would have done previously just to scroll endlessly on other people's stuff, to learn a language that may well help me in interpreting certain texts, certain grimoires and such in the future. So, that's something that I've really kind of helped to transfer my attention from one thing to another, because I need something to feed my little brain, but, it doesn't have to be someone else's stuff that really is meaningless or drama. Not to say everyone else's stuff is meaningless, but you know what I mean? When it's just like some trash content and you're just like, why am I even watching this? I watched one video now, I'm in a doom scroll. It is about kind of going to yourself, how is it affecting it? And here's the thing, I use things like apps like moon phase apps. I use certain tarot apps to sort of learn more things when I'm doing my pulls. On a Monday I normally do it. And it just helps me to learn a bit more about them. And it's convenient because I'm here, there and everywhere at the moment. So so that is really sort of where technology is useful. And just consider where it's not useful, and also consider where aren't using technology. Could you perhaps be using YouTube more effectively? Are there things you could learn from there? Are there audiobooks you could use? We tend to piss on technology a lot, but really it's the human at the end of the day that misuses it, right? And corporations, unfortunately. Always corporations, isn't it? Number 12 is, how much reading or learning time are you giving yourself, right? With my degree at the moment, we get, a certain amount of class time, and then we get a certain amount of time we're expected to read. And I thought about this recently. I thought, how would I apply this to my own practice? Because I thought to myself, right, give me so many hours a week to do my reading for uni, blah, 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 all this stuff. And sure, life gets in the way sometimes, but, I try and dig in and I try and do what I can, right? And I thought the same about witchcraft. Hang on, am I actually giving myself a kind of reading time, a learning time? Because realistically, when you're doing your practice, why wouldn't you want to know more about it? And are there times when I am perhaps using technology or misusing technology when I could be learning something? And imagine if you just read for like 10 minutes, right, or half an hour, or your bus journey, or whatever it is. For example, audiobooks are great, especially when you're travelling or up to something, or doing a task that is kind of just repetitive and you don't need to really pay your sort of mind attention to, just your physical. Think about when you can sort of perhaps combine things to help you. So for me, audiobooks are a real help with that, and lectures and such like, also with technology, actually going to that point, do check out Victor Wynn's museum and the Last Tuesday Society, because they have lectures by really interesting people on the occult, by learned folk, and they're normally about £5 or so, so accessible, and it's a Zoom call, so you have direct access to this person. You can ask some questions, so I highly recommend that. I've learned a lot from those. Number 13, this is a nice one actually, I forgot I wrote this. When did you last celebrate another witch? Now, I spend a lot of time online and in witchy spheres comparing ourselves, right? Thinking, am I witch enough? Am I doing this? Am I doing that? We look at other people and we go, oh God, I wish I had their time, or I had their setup of their offering stead, or I had their book collection, or whatever it might be, right? But forget all that a minute, because you're both practitioners, you're both folks who are trying to dig in through the magical witchy shenanigans, and really everybody I've learned, even the people I really admire, are often quite self-conscious, or they're often quite awkward or nervous, or a bit like, oh blimey, and they're not very confident always. They sometimes put themselves out there and use every ounce they have on trying to project that confidence to benefit us all with different knowledge, right? But actually, the more I've met other witches who are in positions of kind of power as such, the more I've gone, oh God, they're actually just humans like me. And I think with Critical Thinking Witch Collective, I've definitely learned, celebrating each other is so important, because A, you never know what people are going through, but B, there is often so much to celebrate, and perhaps the word that you say to this witch that is just one little bit of praise might completely transform their practice and potentially transform their projection in life. So celebrate each other, meaningfully, simply celebrate each other. So that's our theory, that's our magical thing to do, and I'm wishing you all health and wealth.